Welcome everyone today. We've just started recording of the session. I'm very happy to welcome our guest today, Dr. Leanne Beagley, and I'll introduce her formally very shortly. But thank you to everyone who's joined today for this very popular webinar. So before we get started, as always, we like to do our Acknowledgement of Country, and I would like to recite or read out Spoken Acknowledgement of Country by Jonathan Hill, who's a poet. So just for everyone's comfort, if you're able to mute your voice's audio at the moment, that would be wonderful. So today we stand in the footsteps millennia old. May we acknowledge the traditional owners of where you are today. In my case, it's the Gadigal and Birra Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since men and women awoke from the great dream. Meaningful Aging Australia honours the presence of these ancestors who reside in the imagination of this land and whose irrepressible spirituality flows through all creation. And Jonathan is a poet who lives in New South Wales of Indigenous, First Nations, Filipino and Australian heritage, and he works as a teacher in the field of Aboriginal education. So thank you for taking that moment. As mentioned, as people join today, the United Nations International Day of Friendship happens to be on the 30th of July, and we wanted to acknowledge that. So our wonderful guest speaker, Dr. Leanne Beagley, will speak to us about recognising loneliness and some of the misconceptions about that, especially in the aged care settings. As well as friendship and how we can be a friend to both ourselves and others as a part of caring for our mental health. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Leanne now. Leanne is the Chief Executive Officer at Mental Heath Australia since April 2020. Her background includes clinical qualifications in occupational therapy and family therapy, as well as a Master of Business Leadership and PhD in psychology in organisational culture and performance. Prior to this, working at Mental Heath Australia, Leanne worked for Western Victoria Primary Health Care Network as CEO for 3 years, and with 15 years experience in direct mental health care in clinical settings in Melbourne. Leanne is also a former director of the Mental Health and Drugs at Victorian Department of Health and Human Services, a role that she held for 5 years, which I think you'll agree makes Dr. Leanne eminently qualified to share with us today. Thank you so much, Leanne. I will just simply say, Leanne, a very warm welcome to you. And thank you so much for your time to spend with us today. We'd love to hear from you and then ask some questions after you share with us.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you to everyone who's joined. And I'm just delighted to be here. I appreciate the invitation, and I'd really like to join in that acknowledgement of country. What a lovely way to do it, and to echo the words of the person, a proud Aboriginal person. So I also, when I start any conversation, also want to acknowledge people with lived experience in mental ill health and thank them for the way that their courage and their sharing has guided us and taught us about what's needed and what works and doesn't work. And also, I believe that, it's also be very much worth thanking you and recognising all of you for the work that you do every day in supporting and caring for people in the aged care settings. Now, I can see you, Rachel, and that's all. And I'm not sure if I need to be pinned or if that's just my setup. But I continue, and just let me know if you can't hear or see me in any way. That would be good. So what I wanted to just tell people about very briefly first is about Mental Health Australia. You might or might not have heard of us, but my mother, who's 85, said to me when I was coming to Canberra, and I'm on the land of the Ngunnawal people in Canberra. She said, "What are you going to do? You're going to be working for the government." And I said, "No, I'm going to be shouting at the government." And she said, "Oh, very good. That's what they need." So essentially, this Mental Health Australia is a peak body, the national peak body, independent of government, and we represent all of the various organisations, and not all of them, but many, many organisations, including Meaningful Ageing Australia, as an advocacy group to talk to government and provide advice to government based on the experience of people living and working in the sector. So we do quite a lot of engagement with service providers to ask them what the challenges are and to talk with us about what is needed at a government level to develop policy and make some good decisions about responding to the needs in the community. And so we have about 130 members representing about 1,250 organisations and about 5 million people living with mental illness in the community. So it's quite a broad representation. One of the things that we've noticed, and you might have noticed in your work actually, is that the pandemic seems to have changed the conversation about mental health and mental illness. So I reckon before the pandemic, when we talked about mental health, we really meant mental illness. But these days, when we talk about mental health, it's starting to include things like isolation, loneliness, disconnection, physical and social distancing, and the challenges that come from that imposed disconnection. And we're kind of facing that again, aren't we, with this new wave of COVID that people are now beginning to grapple with. And so there has been some connection via this kind of environment, and I think we've got better at managing that. But I also think that there's been some real challenges, particularly when people have not been comfortable in this kind of online environment. And I think that's been particularly challenging for older people. So when I first came into the role, I was asked to speak to the Royal Commission into Aged Care about mental health. And one of the things that the team had done in their research was identify that 60%, just think about that for a minute, 60% of people living in aged residential care had a diagnosed mental illness, diagnosable mental illness. So often it wasn't diagnosed, in fact, but the estimation was that around 60%. And that would be about the high prevalence disorders we see in the community around anxiety and depression, and challenges that come from dislocation and disconnection with community and family, and that kind of isolation. But I think what we've been doing in the last couple of years, and I'd be really interested in your thoughts on this, but I think what we've been doing as a community is really trying to talk more broadly about social connection, friendship and loneliness, and what we can do to build informal supports in communities and in our workplaces. So I just wanted to let you know I wanted to talk about two particular things. One was about the impact for workers about their own mental health, and one was about loneliness and disconnection, which we know are hidden health risk factors. Loneliness and disconnection creates risk for health and chronic disease. And we also know that more Australians than ever are reporting experiencing loneliness, which is obviously compounded by the pandemic, but everything wasn't perfect beforehand. There's recently been a study from the University of Wollongong, the School of Nursing, that shows that high-risk groups like older people and people with chronic illness are more likely to experience loneliness because of their lack of mobility and chronic pain, and that social disconnection had a profound effect on quality of life and better health outcomes. So, you know, the social restrictions that have been imposed have really been very challenging, and I'm sure you could tell me more about that in your own work day to day. So it's something that we really need to address as a community. And one of our other members, Mental Health Australia, which is called Relationships Australia, have been doing some study on this with the Australian National University about neighbours and neighbourhoods. And what their research has shown was that communities where people connect outside of family and friends we know that they have better mental health, and they're safer and they're more resilient. So sometimes we talk about loneliness as if it's an individual issue, but it's actually a community issue. And it really, their research has shown us that any connections are critical. Any day-to-day neighbourly connections are critical and really important. But of course, friendships are what we're focusing on today. And I discovered this fantastic piece of data. I don't know how into data you are, but as you can see, I'm really into data. People are 7 times more productive at work if their close friend works there too. 7 times more productive. You know, most adults have 2 best friends, and 22% of people live longer if they've got a close friendship network. So friends are critically important. And as we know, young people spend a lot of time socializing, but it's also very critical for people in the older age groups. So before we go to questions, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some research we did last year, where we asked health professionals about, as part of World Mental Health Day, and I'll just give you a plug about World Mental Health Day, which is on the 10th of October, where we celebrate health and wellbeing. We asked healthcare professionals how they were going in terms of the COVID restrictions and the impact on their mental health and wellbeing, and we'll be interested to do this one again, you know, given what's happened in the last 12 months. 86% of people said that the COVID pandemic increased their stress and their pressure. I'm sure that's not a surprise. And 70% said that that had made things worse. So what they've been doing was catching up on extra favourite TV shows, trying to exercise outdoors, cooking and eating better, reading for fun, connecting with people. But what was very interesting was that 66% said their friends and family had been the most important bit. They'd been extremely supportive, and it had been incredibly important to have trusted friends and family members around to support them. So whilst we can put in place supports at work, and kind of formal supports at work, it is the connections, the friends and family, that really make a difference for people in the workplace in terms of COVID. So I might leave it there for now, and we can tease out some more of this as we talk. Rachel?
Certainly. Thank you, Dr. Leanne. I think that's an amazing statistic to hear about, having friends, the benefit of having friends to work with and making friends. You know, that is wonderful. I'm reflecting in my own case. That is really a wonderful thing. Yeah, look, I'm interested. We've just gone past, you know, recognising NAIDOC Week for 2022, and I wondered about us in aged care, our colleagues, our friends, potentially older people in residential aged care, and that element of the complexity of intergenerational trauma and just how we sort of support people in that sense. And do you have anything you can comment on that?
Yeah, so I think what we know from our Aboriginal leaders in this space is that it's much better to talk about social and emotional well-being as a package of ways of thinking about people. We often, as you know, we kind of get in the white approach has been to look for illness, you know, to look and to label illness and to see problems in that kind of medical model. And we know that actually there's a social determinants of health and well-being that and as the research develops, we realize more and more how valuable good connections and good social contact and good support contacts, what a difference that makes for people's health. And so, you know, that amazing television show with the kinder kids and the aged care engagement showed that more than I think anything else I've ever seen, that lovely capacity for just human connection, regardless of age, yeah, and regardless of capability. I think it demonstrated that in a beautiful way. And we know that extended families and extended communities and people gathering around older people are the sorts of communities that are much more able to bounce back from traumatic situations like floods and fires. So that, you know, that where there's strong community connection and bonds in small towns or communities, they're the ones that can bounce back really quickly and support people who are struggling. And we see that post bushfires, you know, we see that someone standing and being interviewed terribly in front of their burnt down house, and there's someone thrusting a microphone in their face saying, you know,
how does it make you feel?
Yeah. What happened to you?
We see that.
And people will often say, yes, well, this is terrible. I have nothing left. And they say, but, you know, people in the town have been just amazing, and I've got somewhere to live, and I've got, without the people around me, I wouldn't be surviving. And, you know, I think sometimes we get into this idea where we have to get some outcomes from our working type relationships with people. We need to see them, you know, more cheerful, or we need to see them more engaged in some activities, or we need to see them, you know, being more engaged with each other. But actually, what's incredibly valuable, and I think the dementia research tells us this, is just the moment of connection, those moments of human connection that you can build with other people, and you know, are incredibly important, and they're life affirming and they're mental health affirming. And I just encourage people to value just that, just the connection, as well as what you can do with the connection, of course, but the connections are incredibly important.
That is so beautifully said. And I would say that probably everyone on this call would really espouse that and try to practice that and encourage that from our own you know, way of being with others and supporting others. So that is just so wonderful to hear. Before we go to some of the questions that people have asked, can I just ask you, as also in my particular personal practice, my faith, there's a notion of what's called a noble friend, but regardless of what it's called, that's really someone who can kind of really have a kind of a support to you in your own kind of development and resilience and learning and journeying with you, I guess, in a sense. So my question is, who do you seek out as your kind of wise counsel or journeying alongside with you as you do this work? If you would care to share.
Oh, that's a great question. I I think it's really important to have safe, confiding relationships at work with other people that you work with who understand the context. One of the things about being CEO, though, is that that's kind of an individual, lonely kind of role. There's no one else around who understands quite like you do inside the organisation, but there's always other people who can provide that support, who share that kind of a role. I've got an amazing team though. I'm very privileged, and so I really appreciate walking alongside of them. But I also have a really strong family and church community that support, within which I find support and a true friendship. So one of the things that I think is interesting is that in caring relationships, we give a lot, right? And partly that's your role, and partly it's what you want to do. People choose to work in this space in order to give. And sometimes we have to learn how to receive too, yeah? And even receive from the people that we're working with, because they have also the desire to help and give. They might be more limited in what they do, but I remember when I was pregnant with my first child, I was like, I was enormous. It was it. And I was doing a family therapy session with a family in the days when I was still working clinically, and the mother was struggling with a very difficult, challenging teenager, and she was feeling very disappointed about how things had turned out. But she provided lovely advice to me as a young mum who hadn't yet had a child. And it was like it kind of changed. It gave her a chance to be helpful and provide advice to me when in fact she was coming in as the patient coming to see me. Do you see what I mean? It was like this amazing rebalancing of the connection. It was incredibly powerful.
Very powerful. That is amazing. Thank you so much.